4, 3, 2. Hello, world, and welcome to part 3 of our continuing series on the origins of Christianity. This is our third video shoot, and I'll go ahead and start by introducing you and me and Bob. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Bob. Hi, Bob.
But first I'll say
today Bob has a dinosaur riding a unicycle on his shirt.
He's always got a weird shirt on.
Yeah.
Got to hand it to Bob for the t-shirts, dude.
Yeah, he knows what's up.
Yeah, Bob knows what's up. Anyway, we decided to get together and look at Christianity and see what can be known from a historical critical perspective, right? I'm Mike Sullivan. I am not a theologian, but I am a lawyer, so I feel qualified to talk about this. Does that make any sense?
I'm Demetria Sullivan. I am 0% qualified for any of this, but I'm along for the ride.
Qualified. So
I'm Samantha Kelty, and I am also 0% qualified for any of this.
So
just to clear it up a little, I've been studying theology my whole life, off and on. It's always been an interest of mine, and so this has been germinating for decades. And, you know, Sam and Demetria want to be on YouTube. So they decided to sign up and be my color commentary.
He actually begged us.
I did not beg you. That's an
over an Italian meal.
That's an exaggeration.
It was all over the Italian meal.
It's actionable slander, actually. I did not beg you.
Well, if you're watching this, then it's one more than I expected.
So last time before we got started, we checked in on your love lives. We do this about once a month. So you were both very single last time. And has that changed, or how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm still single.
You're still single?
Yeah.
But I thought you found Old Southern Money.
I did. I have Old Southern Money, but he's not my boyfriend.
Oh.
Just a little.
You gotta watch out for those Old Southern Money guys. You don't want to be one of his collection of women that he flies into his estate.
Yeah.
That is exactly what you should do.
Yeah, it's like I'm okay with it, I think.
You're
I'm
okay?
at a point in my life where I am okay being flown out.
That's
to
very
an estate.
self-possessed of you. And Demetria, what about your marital status? What's going on?
I've moved on.
And do you have a boyfriend now?
Yeah.
Hot Nick.
Hot Nick.
Hot Nick.
You watching?
Pretty good. And Bob, how are you doing? Bob's doing good. Oh, that was not the middle finger, but it was close.
It was the wedding ring.
Oh, it was the wedding ring.
Yeah.
All right, let's get going. So anyway, in part 1, we eased into it by talking about having belief systems. We all got them. Sometimes we believe things not because we have examined them, but because we kind of emotionally are attached to them. We need to believe things, right? And then I can't be boring you already.
I'm still crying
But
from
we
cringing.
went in depth on that and decided to move forward and challenge our belief in Christianity. So we've been doing that. And then in part 2, we looked really carefully at all the documentary evidence that exists regarding the existence of an actual human being, Jesus Christ. And we looked at all the scholars and what they said and went really in depth. It was really interesting. We talked about like the 50 gospels and other really interesting things. But at the end of the day, we realized that the scholars agree there was a real person, Jesus Christ, but any particular saying or thing that he did is not agreed upon. We don't necessarily know that it happened. I mean, it was the oral tradition for 2 generations. But we did realize that when you take it as a whole, it does paint a picture of a historical reality, even though we can't really count on any one thing here or there. Whether Jesus' words in a particular instance were spoken by him or not, we don't know. But there's a special tone required from the whole context. When I say Jesus said this, Jesus said that, going forward, I think what we mean is we're talking about the Jesus tradition. That is the message, the idea, the point of view, the essence of Christianity as it was established over the first century, both with Jesus and all the people that followed him. Right, so we're going to have to accept that. It's the best we're going to do. Yeah. It's actually pretty good from a historical figure point of view. Like I said, the Buddhas had oral tradition for 500 years before they wrote anything down, right?
Yeah.
But this leaves us free to get into a little bit more of the meat of it, which I'm pretty excited about, although I'm easily excited. We get into the good stuff. As a matter of substance, what was Christianity at its origins? As I said last time, 1 in 4 people in the world are called Christian. So it's an extremely influential tradition. And why is the question? And the answer may lie in like what was being said, what was being believed, and in the context at the time. And that's what we can look at today. We're going to start with the historical context. And I wanted to start with God. Because Jesus was a God guy.
Oh, big time, yeah.
Jesus was a big time God guy. Yeah.
A little a bit much, but
it was the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jesus was about a relationship with God that he had, and he had a perspective on it, and he was sharing it with the world. Right? So we are not going to be able in this room to decide whether God exists, I'm afraid.
Oh.
We just don't have time. It's a voluminous voluminous subject matter, which cannot be covered by us in this room today. But what we can look at is how God was conceived of at the time and how Jesus conceived of God. Because you can compare Jesus to his culture in terms of how he perceived God. You can really learn what the tradition is actually trying to say at its core. In the Old Testament, God was one of many gods at first, back in the polytheism days. But slowly over time, monotheism developed. And by the time we got to the last book, Job, there's just one God. Right? And monotheism had fully developed, which is, a significant evolution in the history of thought. But the Old Testament God is not the same as the New Testament God, right? And I thought, Sam, you were telling me you took a class on the book of Job, which kind of, I thought, encapsulates the Old Testament God pretty well.
Yeah.
And so you're going to kind of run down that story for us, and then we're going to figure out maybe we could compare that to Jesus' God.
Okay. The book of Job.
The book of Job. We don't have to do the whole thing, just a synopsis.
Yeah. So it's a man named Job, and he...
Isn't it Job?
It's Job.
J-O-B.
Job.
It's J-O-B.
I know. I don't know why it's Job instead of Job, but
I don't either.
That's just the way it is. But anyways, he has a wife and kids, and has a lot of wealth and land. And then the devil and God are in heaven looking down, and Satan says, I bet Job wouldn't, still worship you if you took away his property and his kids and everything. And God was like, okay, go take away his land and his family, and we'll see if he still appreciates me. So his family dies, his land is taken away, and he's covered
quite the bet.
He's covered in sores, and he's questioning God, why? What did I do? And then 3 of Job's friends come, and they tell him, if God said you did something bad, then you must have done something bad.
They think that he was suffering because he did something bad.
Yeah.
That is the only logical thing, because otherwise why would God
make you suffer if you didn't do anything? And then Job...
Did he agree with that?
No, he did not agree with that. He was like, I don't know why this is happening. And then he questioned God, and then God came down to him and basically was like, you can't question me because I created the world, and I can essentially do whatever I want. And then Job was like, all right.
It's how dare you question me, the creator of all things, including yourself.
Yeah.
And Job's like, why am I suffering? Why is this happening? God's like, because I said so.
Mm-hmm. And Job is like,
it's kind of
okay with that at the end. And then God ends up giving Job back his land and wealth and family, and
he brings them back from the dead.
He gives them new,
no, he gets a bunch of
brand
new
new kids. Yeah. And then the 3 friends that were on God's side end up being smited by God. They're like, oh, don't be like your friends. I don't really understand why he did that to the friends, because the friends were agreeing with God. So that part is a little fuzzy for me. I'm not really sure about that.
Well, maybe because they were suggesting that Job did something bad?
Maybe. I never was able to grasp that, because they're the ones not questioning God.
Okay. But this is not, this. How do you perceive this God? How would you do, what characteristics would you assign to this vision of what God is in the story?
A harsh punisher, but
he's not even punishing him, though.
But in a really
No, but Job didn't do anything.
Yeah, he's just punishing, but in a non-concrete way.
Punishment implies that someone did something bad and then you punish them.
Yeah.
You don't punish them. If someone doesn't do anything bad, you're not punishing them. You're just hurting them.
Yeah. Maybe.
So why it seems sort of arbitrary. He was putting Job to the test. Right?
Yeah.
The way I see it is Old Testament God is kind of just showing off.
Sort of power hungry.
In a bitter way. Yeah.
Incomprehensible and scary.
Yeah.
And I think we're supposed to put blame on Satan in that story, because technically Satan's the one that killed the family and all that.
God just gave him permission, allowed it to happen.
Yeah, but because God allowed it to happen, I would say it is God's fault.
Yeah.
In the end.
Yeah.
Because God could have stopped
it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he just kind of wanted to see
God's
what happened.
Let's play around.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty heavy story, philosophically speaking.
Yeah.
If you look at the Old Testament, God is good and great. He leads the people out of Egypt. He saves them. The Red Sea comes and engulfs the enemies, and he gives them the promised land.
Yeah.
Right? And God can be slow to anger, rich in kindness, but God can also be arbitrary, capricious, even mean.
Yeah.
And he is the supreme guarantor of law that is to be accepted without question. Why? Because I freaking said so.
Yeah.
And is he supposed to make up for it by giving Job a whole new family and is that supposed to make up for his arbitrariness?
I mean, it does in Job's eyes, but as like a reader,
you're like,
it's like, you can't just give someone like a new wife and new kids and be like, okay, like, bye. Like, that just doesn't work like that.
It goes, the great argument against God's existence and God's goodness is evil, suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Because this is a great argument that's existed throughout millennia. It's like,
yeah.
Well, if God's all good and all powerful, why does he allow suffering?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of answers to that. It's not a big deal to a lot of people, but to a lot of people, it is a big deal. And to a lot of people, it makes them atheists.
Yeah.
So Job is kind of grappling with this problem of human suffering and God's existence and what does God mean and what's my role and all that. Yeah. And that's the Old Testament God.
Yep.
How do you like that God?
Not a fan.
Survey says.
Yeah, not a fan.
Well, that was the God of the Israelites. Someone to be trusted that led them, that saved them, but who ultimately said what the law was and you just accepted it. And that was it. And you had to have trust that God's plan was good, even though, and if you look at all the Old Testament books, they have a God is great, but it's always a complaint too. It's like, hey, God, why am I suffering? Why am I suffering like this? It's always all through the Old Testament.
And God never even gives an answer. Like, he answers their questions like with a question.
Yeah, he doesn't.
He's just like, oh, did you create this?
Yeah. Did you create the world?
Yeah. And
then
they're like, he never is like, this is why I do what I do. It's just like question.
He's not accountable to
man,
to humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and I noticed that at the end, the last thing Jesus said on the cross, what did he say? He said, God, why have you abandoned me?
Interesting.
Right. So he's feeling the way that people in the Old Testament felt. Why did you abandon me? Or in some instances, it's kind of like we all feel that way sometimes. We feel despair.
Yeah.
Like abandoned by God, the universe. Where is the meaning?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? That's like the heavy question of life, right? Yeah. Jesus was different than he existed within this tradition, in the society of Jewish people, all the tradition, all the structures, all the concepts, everything. But his concept of God was radically different. And it was the first point that I think when you ask, why did the Christianity last so long? How has it lasted so long? Is one of the reasons is Jesus is, when you say Jesus again, the Jesus tradition, is that Jesus was different. There's something really different about what he was saying and conceptualizing. And it starts with God. So he wasn't founding a new religion. He was within his own religion, but he called God Abba, right? This was a term of familiarity. Why are you making a barfing noise?
No, I'm not. I'm saying when I just go Abba.
Abba?
Abba.
That's attractive.
It's got me old Southern money.
Don't do this to old Southern money.
That's how you reel them in.
Right. Abba means like daddy. It's a term of familiarity and love, right? So it's like, you call me Papa, right? Yeah. So what you call your dad. But it doesn't, little kids say daddy. You get older, you don't call your dad daddy. But in the Jewish tradition, Abba can be something you call your older father as an adult child. So it's very different than, it implies a personal relationship. It's affectionate. It's respectful of authority and power and trust. But at the same time, it means that you are cared for. Like you feel safe, you feel loved, like a good father, a good parent really, because it wasn't really about gender. How does a good father make you feel? It makes you, like if a kid is loved well by the father, like a girl. Girls that don't have good relationships with their fathers get a little weird.
Hashtag daddy issues.
Daddy issues.
Yeah.
But if you have a good father.
Abba issues.
Yeah, but this was what Jesus is calling God Abba. It's implied that a father who wants you to be cared for and grow. He talks about if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, you'll grow 1,000-fold. What does a parent want? They want their child to flourish, like for who they are, like come to terms with their issues, capitalize on the good things, grow up they want to be safe and nurtured yet challenged, and the child trusts the parent because they know better. And so the parent gives them the law and the rules. Yeah, they have authority and they discipline and they expect respect, but that was sort of Jesus' version. He says that, hey, why do you worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear? Look at the lilies of the field. Look at the birds in the air. God takes care of them. God will take care of you.
Yeah.
That's the God that Jesus is talking about. Or he talks about, he knows all the hairs on your head. Now that's more comfort to some than others. I wouldn't say for some people, it's probably not a great mathematical challenge for God to count how many hairs you have on your head. But the point is that God is preoccupied with your rebellion. They tell the story of the sheep, the lost sheep. So Jesus is the good shepherd, he says, right? And so he cares about his sheep. He knows them and he cares about them, and the sheep love him and he loves them back. But if one of them goes astray, he'll leave the whole herd to go look for that one. Now, is this the God of Job?
No.
Mm-mm.
No. This is like a much different God. You can imagine like when he was saying this stuff, like the people hearing this, like they would be like, you know, they hadn't heard of this before. It was weird. And there was implications to it too. The best image I think that we're given is the prodigal son, right?
Yeah.
So God's the father, and then there's the good son, and he's the guy who does the dishes, who goes to school, gets straight A's, does all the things good. And then the bad son says, hey, give me my inheritance. I want the money. And then he goes off and he parties and he gets drunk and he falls over and he's got no money. He's broke and he's eating pig slop, right? And he comes back and the father is so stoked to see him. He's like, oh my God, he's back. And he gives him the ring and he gives him the robe. And he throws him a feast. And the older brother's like, hey, I've been here doing good the whole time. You know, what's the deal? And the father's like, hey, I love you. You're the greatest, but your brother's back. Yeah. Right. So then this is God. Like he's just preoccupied with the well-being of humanity. Mm-hmm. Not like the God of Job. He doesn't condemn, but always forgives. He doesn't punish, but he liberates. He doesn't really pay attention to what the rules of the law is so much as cares about the developmental well-being of the people. The law serves the people rather than vice versa. And this is the weird thing. He cares about what Jesus is talking about the most is what he cares about the most isn't people that are important or moral or have their stuff together. It's the lost. It's like the prodigal son, the lost sheep, the sinner, the loser, the psychologically trapped. I have here, he prefers this, he prefers the traitor to the judge, like the tax collector, the traitor. Mm-hmm. What are you guys smiling about? He prefers prostitutes to upstanding citizens. This is God prefers prostitutes. He prefers criminals to the affluents. He likes the people that are in trouble. This is the God, the father of the abandoned. That was the God that Jesus talked about, was a father to the abandoned, the lost. You know, this was a radically different point of view about what God was, and it was introduced to humanity in this context of Job. Mm-hmm. And so people were like, "What?" Well, they liked it, but they were like, "Hey, that's not what we're used to."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel like you can't say that it's the same God.
Yeah, it's not like well, it is because he's all powerful. You don't know him. He's up in heaven.
Yeah,
but it's like a totally different God. Huh?
Yeah.
And at least an evolved vision of what God is, or understanding. Yeah.
So I feel like, how can you believe Old Testament and New Testament?
Yeah.
How could you? Maybe you can't.
Well, you do.
Well, see, that's what I'm going to get to next, because I want to talk about the people that existed at the time and how they were reacting to Jesus and what he was saying.
Okay.
Because that really defines him. So first there was the establishment, right? Now, the Romans had conquered the world, and they conquered Israel. So imagine if the Nazis had won.
Well.
What would life be like? You guys wouldn't want to go to a party without an escort, because if the soldiers saw you, they could do whatever they wanted. Nothing you could do about it. You'd be starving. They take your money. They take your taxes. You have no rights. You can't say anything. You're always, it's terrible to live in an occupied country. But they did live in an occupied country. That was the world in which they lived. A place of terrible injustice and oppression all the time. And it's like, how are we ever going to be free? And the people in charge, it was an oligarchy, right? So they let the Jews run their own government because they needed someone to, make the trains run on time. Mm-hmm. There was a Sanhedrin, like 70 priests, and they had absolute power. And they had the high priest who was in charge of just about anything, civilly or criminally. They had elders and scribes, and all the religious people sort of ran everything. You got to remember, like, we have this distinction between church and state. And we have the idea of the unconscious mind, psychology. We have distinctions between culture. We have things that are right or wrong that are not against the law, but things that are against the law that aren't necessarily right or wrong. But they didn't have any of that.
Yeah.
They had God's law that God told them, and they wrote down and they lived by. And that was their culture, and that was their family. Right? So it was like, it's hard to imagine, really appreciate what it was like to be in that kind of environment, because it's so long ago, so different than what we have now. But if you did something wrong, you broke God's law. You betrayed your family. You betrayed your community. And you stabbed your people in the back when they were being oppressed by Romans. So the law was really important. It was more than just like, don't cross the double yellow lines, right? Don't go above 65 miles an hour. If something was immoral, it was against the law. If something was against the law, it was immoral. And it was serious. And everything was knit together. There's only 500,000 people living there in this oppressed, crunched up place. And all they had was that law that God gave them, and their culture that resulted from the law, and their way of thinking and their way of being, and the people that they loved, their family, they all lived together in accordance with this law. And if you didn't, you were undermining everything, and it was really bad. There was this group called the Sadducees, and they were this clerical aristocratic party, and they were aristocrats they would tolerate Rome, but they were trying to preserve the culture. They were trying to make sure that they didn't lose themselves. They were waiting for a Messiah, someone to free them from the Romans, but they had to make sure that people followed the law. They had to make sure that people did the right thing, and they stayed together as a people. So if you didn't follow the law, or if you rejected the law, or you rejected the culture, or you had any objections to this, you were a traitor. You were insidious, a cancer, right? And Jesus, he didn't belong to any of these classes. He wasn't educated. He never had a course of study. He never, he wasn't part of the ruling class. He wasn't a scholar. He was a public storyteller. He told stories of everyday life, and he was intent on this imminent future of a better world, this encounter with God that he was talking about all the time. And he was talking about transformations of the heart, a turning to God, a total surrender of the self to God, which would transform your life. Everybody should repent, right? This was Jesus. He wanted to help people. He wanted to cure people. He wanted to advise and what was important. He wasn't a professional. I wrote down some stuff here. I'm sorry. He was popular and direct, if necessary, biting, provocative. He criticized the powers that be ruthlessly. Everything he said was not super erudite. He wasn't legalistic. You didn't have to have a special language. He told stories from everyday life. Everything he said was pregnant, concrete, vivid. The people that followed him were blue-collar, working-class people. They were just dealing with regular things in life, and he was speaking to them. He was speaking about that. But when it came to God and the Sadducees, he got in trouble because he didn't really care about social injustice. He cared about it, but he wasn't talking about that. He wasn't talking about the oppression of the Romans. He didn't really care about the law. Yeah. The law to him was something deeper than following the rules of the time. And he was kind of setting himself above the law. He would say, don't follow the law if it's not making sense. And he would talk about the temple will be destroyed and raised up in 3 days. The whole social system was in question with the way he was talking. It'd be like the Sabbath, it's like he would cure people on the Sabbath, and they would say, hey, you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath. And he'd be like, what are you talking about? You think the Sabbath is was made for God? It's made for man by God. Yeah. It's like, so what are you doing? What are you talking about? I don't he didn't like this sort of legalistic mentality that the Sadducees presented, and the Pharisees I'll talk about in a second. So he was sort of he would break down, and he said, love your enemies. He said, when you have the lawbreakers and the people that follow the law, the good people and the bad people, he was like, no, everybody's kind of in need of redemption, right? That's not how it works. He's like, it goes deeper than that. He didn't like that. And he got in trouble. He broke down the natural frontiers that exist between people. Normally you have friends and you have enemies. You have family and people that aren't family. You have sinners. You have, things like that. Jesus just wasn't going for that. He was looking at the sick, poor, even the irreligious, the immoral, the godless, the emotionally and spiritually sick. Jesus was a fan of these people. These were Jesus' people and God's people in his view, right? I mean, he was about the lost, the poor, the sick. He was like, let's help. Let's make things better. Let's encounter some truth and change everything. That was Jesus, right? And to the people that wanted to follow the law, that was blasphemy. It was like, no, these people are bad people. If we all acted like them, the whole thing would collapse. So they didn't like it. This is the God of the godless, with a blasphemer as a prophet. And they killed him.
Nope.
They killed him. They killed him because he was a cancer on society, and they thought they were doing the right thing. There's another group called the Zealots. These are the people that wanted to fight Rome and kill the Romans, expel them. And remember we talked about this last time? They actually were pretty successful. They had their rebellion. And then in like AD 66, they successfully rebelled, and the Romans came with a bunch of legions and slaughtered them. Like, slaughtered them all. The Zealots were violent, and they were about establishing justice, freeing their people, you know. In fact, at the end, they had like a bunch of them ended up on Masada. Have you heard about this? Well, it's this big mountain with sheer cliffs, and they're up there for a long time. The Romans surrounded it, and they were like holding out. And at the end, they all cut their own throats rather than submit to Roman rule. Even their children and their wives, they committed mass suicide.
Do they know that's true?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's true.
I'm so glad we were born when we were.
I know, right? Holy.
We really lucked out.
Yeah.
Jesus kind of seems like a zealot because he's a revolutionary. His thinking is radically different. But he wasn't a zealot. He insisted on nonviolence. Jesus would say, you know, he had bigger fish to fry. He didn't care about the Romans, the Sanhedrin, titles, political change, social justice, worldly power. He actually commanded the reverse, which was a renunciation of power, which is weird. I mean, you need power.
Yeah.
He was condemned as a political revolutionary. The Romans executed him because they said he was king of the Jews. And they thought he was leading a revolution, but that was trumped up. He wasn't. He wasn't a revolutionary. He wasn't a zealot. He was trumped up by the Jewish leaders at the time to ensure that the Romans would kill him. And Jesus, though, can be said that he definitely was a revolutionary, but because he was against almost all the principles of the time of the leaders, but not in the sense that he wanted to pick up a sword and fight the Romans. They would say, should we pay taxes to the Romans? And he's like, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. I don't care. Right? He ate and drank with tax collectors who were, right? Like the Romans would sell the office of tax collector, and these were like Jews, and you would go to your family and your friends and tax them, and you would extort more money from them and to give to the Romans and keep it for yourself. So these are the worst traitors, betraying, you know, the people they loved for money. And Jesus hung out with them. Like he'd go to their house and have dinner and get drunk. Not get drunk, but drink.
Yeah.
Alcohol. Right? So they're like, what are you doing? They're like, look at this guy. He's a traitor. Right? But these tax collectors are like, hey, I feel kind of bad about who I am. I want to change. Jesus would talk to them, right? But the people that follow the law were like, no. You're like hanging out with evil people. You're an evil guy because you're not supporting us in the time of greatest need of our culture. He criticized the people in charge as hypocrites. So one of the stories that shows us is the Good Samaritan. Do you know that story, right? Yeah, tell me. You don't know?
No, I do, but I forget.
So thieves come and
I have no idea about this.
Thieves come and they beat up this guy and they leave him for dead. Just rob him. And then along comes a priest. And he sees the guy laying there and he just walks by. And then along comes one of the scholars, the Sadducees. Sees the guy laying there and he just walks by. And along comes a Samaritan. This is a story Jesus is telling people, okay? He's like criticizing the people in charge who are moral, good people. And the Samaritan is like this evil race of people that the Jews hated. They were outside the pale, you know, bad guy. Samaritan picks him up, takes care of him, takes him to a hotel, feeds him, cares for him, pays for him. And now Jesus says, who is the one who's good? And of course, the obvious answer is the Samaritan. But, you know, you can imagine if you were one of the people in charge, you're like, what is that?
Yeah.
Right? So his revolution was different. It was, it was a nonviolent revolution for inside the individual self, Jesus demanded a total conversion of the self and submission to God, and thereby attaining well-being. That's what he was preaching. He talked about like the kingdom of God was coming, and in the kingdom of God would rule, and we'd be done with disease and poverty and sickness of the soul, and freedom, liberation, all these things would come. That's what Jesus was talking about. There was another group. I got two more.
Ooh, here we go.
Treat.
Yeah, we'll treat.
The ascetics. These were monks. They decided to solve the problem of evil in the world by withdrawing. And there was like 4,000 of them, and they all lived. And remember we talked about the caves they found in 1947? They all lived in there and around. They're called the Essenes. And they had these really strict, a strict way of life. They washed their hands in a purified way. You had to wash it twice and do this. And they had strict rules. They didn't eat very much, just enough. And they prayed all day long. And they had a strict hierarchy. Who's in charge because they're the most holy, the elders, and then they did that. It's like you see these monastic traditions in lots of cultures, including the Christian cultures. Jesus seems a bit like an ascetic because he lived an unsettled, wandering life. Unless you do violence to the text, you have to conclude that he was not married. Yeah. And that time meant he was celibate, which is weird because everybody was married. If you were married, you're weird. And so he kind of seems like an ascetic, but he just wasn't. He was not into restraining yourself or self-flagellation or self-deprivation. Just wasn't what he was talking about. Like I said, he ate and he drank, and he would say, hey, no one fasts while the bridegroom is still at the wedding, right? So people, or Martha and Mary, Martha's sitting and talking to him. Mary's like working and working and working. And she's like, hey, Martha's not helping me. Jesus is like, look, your priorities are screwed up. Right? So the ascetics were sexually restrictive. So sex was kind of bad. Like anything of the flesh is bad and anything of the spirit is good. So they didn't have sex unless they were married. And then if the woman's pregnant, because they didn't want to make themselves impure by having intercourse with a woman. Wow. And then if the woman was pregnant, they wouldn't have sex. They couldn't have sex with the woman because it was about reproduction. They weren't. The pleasures of the flesh were kind of bad. But Jesus had nothing to say about sex, like really ever. He's not really interested in it. They had a hierarchy and moral authority that they lived by. But Jesus, it's funny. It's like I was saying before. Jesus was talking about powerlessness. He didn't agree that promoting yourself was a good thing. He would say, if you want to, he who humbles himself will be exalted, and he who exalts himself will be humbled. Right? Now, that's a provocative, weird thing to say. Like when you think about it, even in the modern times. So let's say you are you're conservative, like politically conservative. You might say, go to school, learn, empower yourself, equip yourself, go out into the world, get into the market, make something good, make money, enlighten self-interest, obtain power. If you're to the left, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, it's about empowerment, right? Because without empowerment, you can't make choices. You can't operate in society. You just live in an oppressed state. But here's Jesus saying, no, you should make yourself powerless. You should be humble. You should be meek. You should not seek worldly things. So, what is that? Does that make any sense?
No. That literally doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. That doesn't make any sense. So the ascetics were looking at Jesus like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Why would you?
I agree with the aesthetics.
Why don't you stand up for yourself? Why don't you? Yeah. What is it? So it's a really thought-provoking thing and very disconcerting, right? Because it kind of turned the whole world on its head. I mean, what, are we just going to submit to the Romans and never fight them? And we're going to just be weak sauce and never stand up for ourselves? I think probably, it's, you could see like the look on your face, look on my face, right? You're like, huh? Right? But that's what Jesus was doing all over the place. Everyone was like, well, there's something appealing about what you're saying, but I can't quite put my finger on it. And it's kind of challenging, and I don't really like it.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't make sense in one sense. But on the other hand, there's something about it that is making me think. Like, I think maybe some of the times in life when you realize you're full of shit are some of the most valuable times that you have. Right? Or some of the times when you... What about Jesus say, hey, if someone slaps your face, offer the other cheek?
I'd be like, no.
If someone steals your coat, give them your shirt. So what, you never stand up for yourself? Like there's no self-defense?
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
No.
Doesn't make any sense. Or does it make sense? Maybe it makes sense. Because Jesus was talking about breaking the cycle of violence. Like you see it with Gandhi in India, non-violence, acceptance leads to peace. It's like you can't be affected by anybody else. You know what I mean? Like spiritual masters, you see people like that, don't you? You see people that are generous with enemies. Jesus would say, love your enemies, do good to those who hurt you. What is that? Why would you ever do that?
Yeah.
Why would you do that? You would divest yourself of any worldly advancement of power.
Then you're not strung up on it.
Yeah, but Jesus is like about the interior life. He's saying about the interior life, the recognition of your own flawed nature and a turning away from it and letting go of any pretense of power. And in society, you have a cycle of violence, the struggle for power all the time. And that time it was Romans versus Jews, but it's always in one form or another. Anyway, it was really thought-provoking, and a lot of people hated it, and a lot of people were really angry. And finally, we get to the Pharisees, right? Oh. So the Pharisees are put forth as like Jesus' biggest enemies. He called them a nest of vipers. He did not like the Pharisees. But the truth is the Pharisees were made out to be worse than they really were. They're like a group of tradesmen, middle-class people that wanted to be really devout. They were like the church people. You know what I mean? People that tried to be very moral.
Right.
You know, the kind of people I'm talking about? And they were not bad people. They did good things. They gave alms. They prayed like 3 times a day. They didn't try and fight the Romans.
They're just too try hard for him.
They were, the thing about it is that, you know how they destroyed the temple and what's so funny?
I'm just laughing.
I forget you spontaneously giggle.
Yeah.
Well, the Pharisees were the only ones left after they did that. And so because the rebels, the zealots, they all died.
Yeah.
Right? On Masada and before that. So the Pharisees were the ones that were opposing Christianity at the time the Gospels were actually written. So they ended up being the bad guys. Yeah. But
a little Billie Eilish.
That's a bummer for them. But the thing about it is they were kind of a pain in the neck because they were super duper like moral. So for example, like one of the rules is keep holy the Sabbath. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. The law is really important, right? So their solution, but people would be like, oh, my ox fell in the pit, but I can't get him out on the Sabbath and he's going to die.
Right.
So the Pharisees were trying to be nice and say, okay, we're going to make some little rules and regulations and we're going to have exceptions. But then they started getting really aggro with it. They had rules for everything. Like if on the Sabbath, the chicken laid an egg, could you get the egg out of yes, you could. Right. But that's because there was a rule. So there's always more rules from the beginning to the end of the day. There's a rule for everything. They're very like morally legalistic. And to them, like being a good person, being moral, being close to God, being a good Jew, all this being good, having a good life was about being moral, which meant following all the rules. And if you didn't have a rule, you made up a rule, and following rules made you moral. And that was them. They were fastidious about washing their hands. They prayed 3 times a day. And guess who wasn't moral? Right? Everybody else, right? Because you can't possibly keep track of all this stuff.
Yeah.
They also tithed, and so tithing is giving 10% to the church, right? And that was the way they had taxation, right, for the church and for the government, which is the same thing. So they did that too, and then no one else tithed, so they were kind of morally superior. They're kind of like, look at me, and so they're pretty good people. So why did Jesus hate these guys? Because he did. He did not like them. They drove him nuts, right? So he started, and it was because they solved the harshness of the law by being always more exacting, lots of laws, lots of regulations, saying what's a sin and what's not. And there was this zeal for the law and dread of sin. You know what I'm talking about? The people, it's always like, what's right? What's right?
Yeah.
What's wrong? What's wrong? People like the Kohlberg levels of moral maturity. Do you guys study those in school? You're a psychology major.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
I think I
remember like levels of moral maturity. The fourth level is right and wrong.
Yeah.
Fifth level is rebellion. Sixth level is self-actualization.
Yeah.
They're like stuck on the
I
fourth
think we
level.
learned that.
They segregated. He didn't like it. Jesus would say, look, you strain out a gnat and you swallow a camel. You're so concerned with tiny little things that you're not looking at what's supposed to matter inside a human being. Mm-hmm. So he tells the story of the tax collector. The tax collector is the evil, traitorous tax collector. Goes into a temple and he says, he repents. He says, God, he tears his clothes. He says, God, I'm sorry. I'm going to stop doing it. I'm going to give back the money I stole. I'm going to be a different guy. And then the Pharisee comes in and says, I thank you, Lord, that I am so moral and so holy. And I'm not like that tax collector over there.
Yeah.
And Jesus is like, okay, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy here? Because he was calling them out on their hypocrisy. Like, so people, have you noticed that people will use morality or religiosity to justify themselves? Like, I'm better than you because I am with God and I am acting correctly. That was those guys. And Jesus hated that because, what'd you do? Was that water?
Yeah.
So he would preach against it all the time. He was weird. Jesus was weird because on the one hand, he was stricter than them. But on the other hand, he was incredibly more lax. So Jesus would say, you've been commanded not to kill. But I tell you, if you have anger in your heart, you're already killing. And people would say, no, you're not. You're just being angry. But what's he talking about? He's talking about it like in the intent you have. Like if you're an angry person, you're trapped by that. You're like, you're trapped by anger inside you. Mm-hmm. It owns you, right? Or he'd say like, you've been told don't commit adultery. But I tell you, if you're looking at a woman with lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery against your wife. And people say, no. I mean, who doesn't have thoughts? We're only human, right? But what he's talking about is the lecherous guy who's going around. He's looking at the girls and he's you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But maybe he can't close the deal. Maybe he wouldn't, but he's got that in him, he's stuck.
Yeah.
So Jesus was like talking about, it's not just about following the rules. It's about having integrity within yourself, having freedom within yourself, not being trapped by things that you can't have, or things that control your mind or your behavior. Mm-hmm. So he was kind of stricter than them because it wasn't about the rules, but you had to actually have goodness inside you. And if you didn't, you had to find a way out. So he's kind of stricter than the Pharisees. Kind of hardcore, actually. That's really hardcore because, who has that sort of psychological integration?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Only
the oldest and wisest, right? Not many people that do that. I remember at the Coffee Bean, the guy Stosser hated, and he would be like very full of himself, and he would take his shirt off and he would sit on the top of the hill and adopt this Buddhist meditation pose.
I think I saw him a few times. Yeah.
So he's like, yeah, what a deep guy. Everybody sees what a deep guy is on top of the hill, right? Yeah. So Jesus would talk about that kind of thing with the Pharisees. Say, you hypocrites. All you do is to try and look good. You don't have any love in you, inside you. You're just about rules. And you're about rules because it gives you power and makes you feel superior. Would you knock it off? Jesus hated that. It's like nest of vipers. You make other people like you. And they're losing themselves. He hated that. He tells the story of the prodigal son, right? Of the repentant tax collector, the lost sheep, the lost coin. To the Jews, to the Pharisees, to the Sadducees, to the leadership of the Jews. This was offensive, subversive. It was tearing down the law. It was tearing down their culture. He threatened to lose it all. Jesus placed himself above the law. When it came to the Sabbath, he would say, Sabbath is not made for man. Man is made for the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. He would cure people. He would let people eat on the Sabbath. He didn't care. He's like, look, follow all the laws, but the Sabbath is here to make us better. And the leadership would say, no, Sabbath is for God. God said you do it. You freaking do it. And Jesus is like, no, Sabbath is for man. God is for the people. And so there was this fundamental difference, this change in how God was seen and how people were supposed to act. The purity laws too. Jesus would say, nothing that goes in a man, you have to wash your hands, you have to wash the dishes. Jesus would say, nothing that goes into you can make you impure. Only what comes out of you makes you impure. Dummy. It's not about like following a rule.
Yeah.
It's got nothing to do with it. It's about who you are and how you're being. Mm-hmm. That matters. And only by turning to God and giving yourself totally to God can you achieve this state of being of inner freedom and liberation. So, Jesus got killed, right? Mm-hmm. I didn't like that. It all sort of culminates in my mind in the adulteress woman story. You know the story of the adulteress woman? Mm-mm. You probably heard of it. So what happens is that the Pharisees get a big idea. And they say, okay, Jesus wants to tear down the law. He wants to just relativize virtue, morals. Everything is okay if it's in your heart, right? Let's see how it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. We don't punish criminals. This woman was found in the act of adultery. Mm-hmm. Now the law says we stone her to death. Jesus, right? And look, adultery back then wasn't like adultery now. You didn't go to a bar and have adultery and no one knew. I mean, you live in a small community. Everyone was related to you, right? There wasn't any birth control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're having unprotected sex with your brother's wife.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Society could not you got married when you're 15, you died when you're 40, women are pregnant all the time. It's a small community. I mean, adultery was bad news. It would mess things up, and it was against the law, and you would die if you did it.
Yeah.
Right? Kind of like, in the eyes of the people then, it's like being a pedophile would be now.
Oh, wow.
You are a worthless sack of poo-poo. And you got to go, right? So they bring this woman in there. It's not like, it's different than today. But so they bring the woman and they say, Jesus, she got caught in the act. The law says we should stone her. So what about all your forgiveness and your love and all that BS? Should we execute the law or not? Mm-hmm. Right? And they're going to get him. They're going to trap him. And Jesus has a famous line. He squats down in the dirt and he draws with his finger, which means the story was probably true because it's this detail that doesn't make any sense. It's stuck in the story. Mm-hmm. But he says, okay, but he is without sin, cast the first stone.
It's a good one.
And then they're like, crap. Right?
Yeah.
Because Jesus isn't saying forget about the law, don't follow the law, don't be a good person. You should do that. Society should have coherence. But he's talking about what's going on inside people. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay. And so it's like a bazinga, big time, right? The biggest bazinga maybe in Western history. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a big and it's pretty cool. And the first ones to walk away are the Pharisees. They don't stone her because they know he's right, and they have to rethink who they are.
Yeah.
Right. So, and he says to the woman, "Is there no one left to condemn you?" She says, "No." He says, "Nor do I condemn you, but don't do this anymore. It's not good for you."
Yeah.
So that's the main story. There was only one forgivable sin in the way Jesus talked, which is the rejection of forgiveness itself. Everything else you could come back from. You could be forgiven. How many times should we forgive? As many as 7 times? 70 times 7, right? Mm-hmm. Endless, unrelenting forgiveness. Like a love without boundaries was what he was talking about. And that just wasn't conceivable. It was impossible to the people of his time. And honestly, it's lasted 2,000 years, and it's been kind of inconceivable to every generation. It's really challenging. Like, how do you do that?
Yeah.
It seems like you can't. Right? How do you do that?
Yeah.
Do you even want to do that? It's like at the same one time, it doesn't make any sense. And on the other hand, it's sort of really compelling. And that was Jesus back in the day. So ironically, it was the devout who found it the hardest to repent. The moral people, they can't see their own BS. It's the people that are screwed up that go, it's easy to say, yeah, okay, I've got to change.
Yeah.
But the people that think they have their stuff together, they can't. They're too stuck. They can't see their own need of change. the people who killed Jesus were highly moral people. They thought that by killing Jesus, they were doing a service to God. So, I'm going to wrap it up.
All right.
Jesus, summarizing, he wasn't a member of the establishment. He wasn't part of the revolution against the Romans. His revolution was different than that. He wasn't an ascetic. Self-deprivation wasn't his thing. He wasn't about compromise and finding a way to apply the law. You know? Mm-hmm. He was different than any group. He didn't fit anywhere. He was a man who had no formula. But what we've discussed so far is just Jesus in light of the other groups, the groups that existed in his historical time period. Next time, I think we can look a little bit more into the more positive way of looking at what was his center. What was this really about? Mm-hmm. Kind of a thing.
Fair enough.
Sounds good.
That's all I wanted to talk about today.
Signing off.
You guys good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, you go to the party?
Yeah. Go to Izzy's house.
All right. Thanks for stopping by. Bye, Mom.
Bye.
Bye. Oh, I didn't know.
I didn't either. I like sort of.